The First World War left profound scars across Canada. Scars evident not only on the faces of returning veterans, but on the entire national psyche. A country of barely 8 million had sacrificed over 60,000 dead and more than 170,000 wounded in Europe's mud. Entire towns in Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Nova Scotia had lost nearly every male of military age. The names Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele, and the Somme were etched into stone monuments, but they were also etched into family memory. By the 1920s and 1930s, Canada was a nation striving to exist between the shadows of two storms. It was still part of the British Empire, yet increasingly asserting autonomy. It was a growing industrial nation, yet still profoundly rural. And perhaps most importantly, it was a country that desired peace more than anything else. The interwar period intensified that desire. The decade following the Great War brought optimism, then economic hardship. Armies of unemployed men roamed the streets during the Great Depression. In prairie provinces, dust storms ruined harvests. Factories closed in Montreal and Toronto. Confidence in government and economics crumbled. Many Canadians sincerely believed, that another European conflict would obliterate civilization itself. Politically, Canada navigated a careful course. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, a man cautious to the point of obsession, wanted nothing to do with another European war. He viewed conflict as a force that could shatter the fragile balance between English and French Canada. In Quebec, the memory of forced conscription during World War I still burned like an open wound. In British Columbia and Alberta, thousands of unemployed veterans felt betrayed by the government that had sent them to fight. Across the country, the phrase "never again" was more than a slogan. It was a national instinct. Meanwhile, the world was drifting toward catastrophe. Though far from Europe, Canada was not blind. Newspapers reported Hitler's speeches, German rearmament, the crushing of political opposition, the persecution of Jews, the invasion of Austria, the dismantling of Czechoslovakia. The League of Nations, intended to maintain peace, collapsed in front of the world's eyes. Yet, even as these threats escalated, Canada clung to isolation. The nation did not feel prepared, neither materially nor psychologically, for another war. The armed forces were minuscule. The Royal Canadian Navy possessed only a handful of ships. The Army had fewer than 5,000 regular soldiers. The Royal Canadian Air Force, though growing, was still nascent and lightly equipped. For a population scattered across a vast continent, war seemed like distant thunder. Something happening over there that somehow might bypass them. But beneath the surface, another sentiment persisted. Quiet yet powerful. Many Canadians still felt a sense of duty toward Britain, the country that had once been Mother Empire. They read British newspapers, watched British films, and shared British anxieties. Even those who desired peace knew that if Britain were drawn into a fight for survival, Canada would not stand aside. In Indigenous communities, men who had volunteered in the Great War passed down stories to younger generations, stories of loyalty, courage, and the hope that military service could earn respect for their people. In immigrant neighborhoods, Ukrainian, Polish, Dutch, Jewish families watched with horror as their homelands fell under Nazi expansion. Many realized, long before Ottawa did, that Hitler's ambitions would not stop at Europe's borders. Thus, Canada entered the late 1930s torn between two truths: a desperate longing to avoid war and a growing awareness that war might no longer be avoidable. It was a small country in a perilous world. But that small country was about to undergo one of the most dramatic transformations in modern history politically, militarily, economically, and emotionally. And the catalyst for that transformation was only months away. On September 1, 1939, German tanks rolled into Poland. Britain and France issued ultimatums, and when Hitler refused to withdraw, declared war. Radio broadcasts spread across Canada like wildfire. Families gathered around wooden radio sets, listening to crackling BBC and CBC reports describing the rapid collapse of Europe's fragile peace. But something remarkable happened. Unlike 1914, when Canada automatically entered World War I with Britain, Ottawa now had a choice. Under the Statute of Westminster, 1931, Canada was no longer compelled to follow Britain's declarations. The decision to go to war would be Canada's and Canada's alone. For a moment, the nation hesitated. Debates erupted in Parliament. English-speaking MPs argued that Canada had a moral obligation to defend freedom. Quebec MPs insisted that Canada should not be drawn into another imperial war. Mackenzie King, cautious as always, hoped that diplomatic pressure might still avert the conflict. But reality intervened. Poland fell in weeks. German expansion showed no signs of stopping. Refugees fled. Jewish Canadians wrote desperate letters to family trapped in Europe. British newspapers warned that Hitler intended to dominate the entire continent. Then came the moment that defined a generation. On September 10, 1939, 7 days after Britain, Canada formally declared war on Germany. It was not a symbolic act. It was a sovereign act, a statement that Canada now controlled its own destiny in global affairs. Crowds gathered spontaneously in Toronto, Vancouver, Winnipeg, and Halifax. Some cheered, some wept, others stood silently, remembering the last war's graves. Almost immediately, thousands of young men volunteered. Recruiting stations overflowed. Some arrived wearing their father's old World War I boots. Others brought letters from mothers begging the recruiters not to accept their sons. Many joined out of loyalty to Britain. Others out of a belief that fascism had to be confronted. Still others simply because it felt like the right thing to do. The initial mobilization was chaotic. Canada had military uniforms for barely a fraction of the volunteers. Training camps sprang up overnight. Vaucartier, Pedowa, Shiloh, and others, often lacking equipment, rifles, even boots. Some recruits practiced with wooden models because real weapons were in short supply. But the spirit was unmistakable. Canada would fight. Even more significant was the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, CAT. Canada agreed to host a vast network of airfields, classrooms, and training facilities that would turn out tens of thousands of pilots, navigators, and flight engineers. Over the next 6 years, more than 130,000 aircrew from across the Commonwealth would train in Canadian skies. The country became quite literally the aerodrome of democracy. Yet beneath the surge of patriotism, tensions simmered. Quebec remained deeply divided. Memories of the 1917 conscription crisis resurfaced. Many French Canadians believed Ottawa would again drag them into a conflict that had little to do with their lives. Mackenzie King promised conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. He meant it. Canada would rely on volunteers for as long as possible. Immigrant communities, especially those from Eastern Europe, felt another kind of pressure. Many were labeled enemy. Aliens. Ukrainians, Germans, and Italians faced suspicion and surveillance. Jewish Canadians, meanwhile, begged the government to accept more refugees, pleas that Ottawa tragically ignored. Still, the die was cast. War committees formed. Scientists, industrialists, and union leaders began planning for a wartime economy. Women prepared to enter factories. Farmers pledged to increase food production. The small, uncertain nation of the 1930s began shifting, slowly at first, then with gathering force, into a country ready to shoulder a global burden. Canada had chosen war. But it had also chosen responsibility, sacrifice, and transformation. A nation that had spent 2 decades trying to avoid entanglement in European affairs was now stepping onto the world stage, determined, hesitant, proud, and afraid all at the same time. The next 6 years would reshape everything Canada believed about itself. Long before Canadian soldiers set foot in Europe, their fate and the fate of the entire Allied war effort was being decided on a cold, endless ocean. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a single battle, but a 6-year struggle for survival. It was the longest continuous campaign of World War II, and for Canada, it was the war. At dawn, the port of Halifax vibrated with the noise of engines, cranes, and boots on metal decks. Convoys of merchant ships lined the harbor. Grain from the prairies, aluminum from Quebec, aircraft engines from Ontario, food from maritime fisheries. All of it destined for Britain. Without these supplies, the United Kingdom would starve. Without these convoys, there would be no D-Day, no liberation of Europe, no hope of victory. And guarding those convoys was a navy that barely existed. In 1939, Canada entered the war with 13 ships and fewer than 3,500 sailors. By 1945, it would command the third largest navy in the world with hundreds of escort vessels, corvettes, minesweepers, and frigates. The transformation was staggering, achieved under relentless pressure. The enemy was the German U-boat, silent, invisible, deadly. Their goal, choke off Britain's supply lines and force surrender. The North Atlantic became a hunting ground. In winter, waves rose higher than houses. Ice formed on decks so thick that crews chipped it away with axes to prevent ships from capsizing. Many Canadian sailors learned quickly that the sea itself was often deadlier than the enemy. The Royal Canadian Navy, RCN, though inexperienced, grew fast. Escort ships such as the Flower class corvettes, small, cramped, and notoriously unstable, became the backbone of Canadian convoy defense. Sailors slept beside depth charges, ate meals in rolling storms, and spent days soaked to the bone. Despite limited training, they improvised tactics, refined sonar techniques, and mastered the brutal rhythm of convoy warfare. The Royal Canadian Air Force contributed from above. Long-range patrol aircraft, Catalinas, Hudsons, Liberators, flew out of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, scouring the gray waves for U-boat periscopes. The ocean seemed infinite, yet a single missed sighting could doom an entire convoy. For the Canadians, the battle was personal. Ships sank within sight of Halifax. Survivors washed ashore on Newfoundland beaches. Fishermen pulled bodies from the water. Evidence that the war was not happening an ocean away, but at Canada's doorstep. As the campaign intensified, U-boat formed wolf packs, coordinated assaults that struck convoys with ruthless precision. Entire nights were illuminated by burning ships. Sailors described watching comrades slip beneath freezing water, unable to rescue them without risking their own vessel. Yet, the Canadians adapted. Escort groups grew more skilled. Radar and sonar improved. Escort carriers provided air cover further into the Atlantic. And the RCN's relentless escort schedule wore down the U-boat fleet. By 1943, the tide had turned. Canada was now one of the primary protectors of the North Atlantic. Many Allied ships reached Britain only because young Canadian sailors, some as young as 18, held the line against U-boat in the deadliest waters on Earth. The Battle of the Atlantic was not glamorous. There were no liberation parades, no captured cities, no iconic photos, but it was decisive. Without Canada's navy and air force keeping Britain alive, every later victory, Italy, Normandy, the Scheldt, the liberation of the Netherlands would have been impossible. It was the silent war. The Cold War, the war of endurance, and Canada had helped win it. If the Atlantic was Canada's lifeline war, Hong Kong and DEP were its cruel awakening. Two early battles that revealed both the courage of Canadian soldiers and the terrible cost of ill-prepared, ill-planned operations. Hong Kong, a distant battleground. In late 1941, as tensions with Japan escalated, Britain requested reinforcements for the colony of Hong Kong. Canada agreed to send 2 battalions, the Royal Rifles of Canada. and the Winnipeg Grenadiers. Many soldiers were young, inexperienced, and unfamiliar with tropical warfare. They believed their mission was garrison duty. They were wrong. On December 8, 1941, hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan struck Hong Kong with overwhelming force. Canadian troops suddenly found themselves fighting veteran Japanese units in brutal urban and hillside battles. Outnumbered and lacking air or naval support, they fought desperately, house to house, trench to trench. At Wong Nai Chung Gap, whole platoon were wiped out. At Stanley Village, Grenadiers charged Japanese positions with bayonets, knowing they would not return. After 17 days of relentless assault, Hong Kong fell. Nearly 300 Canadian soldiers were killed. The survivors were marched to prison camps. There the suffering continued. Starvation, beatings, disease, and forced labor killed hundreds more. Hong Kong became a symbol, not of failure, but of sacrifice in a fight Canada had barely begun to understand. DEP, the bloodiest single day for Canada. If Hong Kong was tragedy, DEP was catastrophe. On August 19, 1942, Allied planners launched Operation Jubilee, a frontal assault on the heavily fortified French port of DEP. The goal was to test amphibious assault tactics and gather intelligence. But the plan was flawed from the start. Insufficient naval bombardment, tight beaches hemmed by cliffs, and German machine gun nests positioned for maximum devastation. Nearly 5,000 Canadians made up the bulk of the attacking force. Many were young men who had trained in Britain for years, eager to prove themselves in combat. Their chance came, and it became a slaughter. As landing craft approached the shore, they were met with a storm of machine gun fire. Tanks struggled to move on the loose pebbles. Some never made it off the landing craft. Communications broke down. Units were pinned on open beaches with nowhere to run. Within hours, the beaches of DEP were choked with smoke, shattered vehicles, and bodies. More than 900 Canadians were killed. Nearly 2,000 were taken prisoner. It remains one of the darkest days in Canadian military history. And yet from this disaster came painful but essential lessons. Allied planners studied DEP meticulously. The failures at DEP directly influenced the planning of D-Day. Heavier bombardment, specialized landing craft, better intelligence, and more flexible strategy. Many historians argue that the sacrifices at DEP saved thousands of lives in Normandy. The psychological shock for Canada. The psychological impact was profound. The public, eager to believe in a noble, clean war, was confronted with brutal reality. Canada would not be spared. Tragedy. The country realized that war demanded not only patriotism, but blood, discipline, and endurance. In the soldiers' letters, in the veterans' eyes, and in the grief of families, one truth became clear. Canada was no longer on the fringes of global conflict. It was fully involved, fully committed, and deeply wounded. Yet, these wounds hardened resolve. The nation did not retreat from war. It prepared to fight with greater determination and competence. Canada would learn from its early tragedies, and those lessons would shape its victories in Italy, Normandy, and beyond. The baptism of fire was complete. By mid-1943, Canada's army, bloodied at Hong Kong and DEP, but vastly more experienced, was preparing to enter one of the most punishing theaters of the war, Italy. The campaign was meant to weaken Germany by attacking the soft underbelly of Europe. But for Canadian soldiers, nothing about Italy was soft. The invasion began in Sicily in July 1943. Canadian troops landed under blistering heat, choking dust, and swirling clouds of mosquitoes. They fought across rugged Hills and sun-baked towns, chasing retreating German forces who destroyed bridges and planted mines at every turn. The Canadians quickly discovered that Italy was not one long advance, but a staircase of mountains, each one a fortress. After Sicily came the mainland. Rain replaced dust. Mud replaced sand. The terrain rose sharply, valleys, cliffs, stone villages, and ridges defended by seasoned German troops. The front line was not straight. It was a twisting maze of slopes, vineyards, olive groves, and shattered farmhouses. The Canadians, part of the British Eighth Army, found themselves engaged in a relentless series of grinding assaults. The Moro River, San Leonardo, Arieli, and most famously, Ortona, a medieval town turned death trap. Ortona, the Little Stalingrad. In December 1943, Canadian troops entered Ortona's narrow streets. German paratroopers, a highly trained elite force, waited inside stone buildings rigged with booby traps. Every doorway was a kill zone. Every corner hid a machine gun. Tanks could barely maneuver. Infantry advanced house by house, wall by wall. The Canadians responded with innovation. They invented a brutal tactic called mouse holing, blasting holes through interior walls so soldiers could move between buildings without stepping into the open streets. It was dangerous, claustrophobic work. Explosions showered rooms with dust and stone. Many soldiers described Ortona as a nightmare of echoing footsteps, sudden gunfire, and the constant smell of explosives and burning rubble. Civilians were trapped inside, too. Families huddled in basement while battles raged overhead. Canadian medics treated both soldiers and townspeople, often under sniper fire. By the time Ortona fell, more than 500 Canadians were dead. It was a hard-won victory that scarcely made headlines back home. But for the men who fought there, Ortona left scars that lasted a lifetime. The D-Day Dodgers myth. While Canadian troops battled through Italy's mountains in 1944, rumors spread in Britain that the Italian front was easy, that those fighting there were avoiding the real war in Normandy. Someone jokingly called them D-Day Dodgers. The Canadians were furious. They slogged through mud so deep it pulled boots off. They marched under artillery fire, across minefields, up slopes so steep they had to crawl on hands and knees. They fought malaria, typhoid, dysentery, frostbite, and exhaustion. The casualty rate in Italy was among the highest of any Allied theater. In response, soldiers wrote satirical songs about being Dodgers, masking their frustration with dark humor. But the bitterness was real. They felt forgotten, overshadowed by Northwest Europe, even as they endured some of the toughest fighting of the war. An unseen victory. The Italian campaign did not end with a single triumphant moment. It was a slow, painful grind, breaking the German defensive lines one by one. The Gustav Line, the Hitler Line, the Gothic Line. Each breakthrough cost blood. Yet these battles pinned down elite German divisions, diverting them away from Normandy. The Canadians in Italy helped make D-Day possible by forcing Germany to fight on another front. Historians agree without the sacrifices in Italy, the liberation of Western Europe would have been far more costly. The Italian campaign was Canada's mountain crucible. It forged resilience, creativity, and unity under unimaginable hardship. The men who fought there were anything but Dodgers. They were veterans of one of the war's most unforgiving landscapes, and they carried Italy's mud in their boots for the rest of their lives. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history crashed onto the beaches of Normandy. Among the 5 landing zones, one was assigned entirely to Canada. Juno Beach. Juno Beach. The assault As landing craft approached the shore, German artillery lit the horizon with fire. The water churned with bullets. Many landing craft were hit before their ramps even dropped. But when they did, Canadian soldiers charged through chested water onto mined beaches under machine gun fire against fortified positions designed to annihilate the attackers. The fighting at Juno was fierce. Houses, bunkers, and sea walls were fortified with interlocking fields of fire. Entire platoon were pinned down within seconds of landing. Yet by midday, Canadian units had pushed further inland than any other Allied force on D-Day. It was a proud moment, one at terrible cost. The Normandy meat grinder. After the beaches came the hedge, dense, tangled walls of vegetation that turned every field into a fortress. The Canadians fought in the Cannes sector, enduring intense bombing raids, artillery barges, and counterattacks from some of Germany's best divisions, including the 12th SS Panzer Division. The fighting around Karpik, Byron, and Verrier Ridge became symbols of Canadian determination. Progress was measured not in kilometers, but in hedge captured, crossroads seized, and ridge lines held at dawn. The cost was staggering. Entire companies were reduced to a handful of survivors. Many units suffered casualty rates rivaling the worst battles of World War I. Yet the Canadians held Fowl's Pocket, the closing trap. By August 1944, the Germans were retreating. The Allies sought to encircle them in a massive pincer movement near Falaise. Canadian forces formed the northern arm of the trap. What followed was chaos. Columns of German vehicles wrecked, tanks, burning fields, and choking smoke. The Canadians fought through scenes of destruction few could have imagined. When the pocket finally closed, tens of thousands of German troops were dead or captured. It was one of the decisive victories of the Western Front. The Scheldt, Canada's forgotten hell. Then came the Scheldt Estuary, perhaps Canada's most under-recognized battle. By autumn 1944, Antwerp, a major Belgian port, had been captured intact. But the waterways leading to it were still controlled by German forces. Without opening the Scheldt, the port was useless, and the Allied advance risked collapsing from lack of supplies. The task of clearing the Scheldt fell almost entirely to the 1st Canadian Army. It was a nightmare. The terrain was a swampy maze of dikes, flooded fields, mudflats, canals, and narrow causeways. Perfect defensive ground for the Germans. The Canadians fought through knee-deep mud across exposed causeways under constant fire and in drenched uniforms that never dried. Artillery sank into the muck. Tanks stalled. Yet they advanced slowly, painfully, relentlessly. Walcheren Island, Brin's Pocket, the South Beveland Isthmus, each required amphibious assaults, brutal infantry combat, and innovating engineering solutions. By November 1944, the Scheldt was finally cleared. Antwerp opened. The entire Allied effort in Western Europe was saved from logistical collapse. Canada's road to victory. Normandy tested Canada's courage. Filesy tested its resolve. The Scheldt tested its endurance. Together, these battles shaped Canada's wartime reputation. A force capable of tackling the hardest assignments, often with little recognition, and completing them at great cost. The road from Juno to the Scheldt was paved with sacrifice, determination, and leadership that reshaped how the world viewed Canada's army. Canada was no longer the inexperienced nation of 1939. It was now a veteran power, scarred, proud, and essential to Allied victory. Long before Canadian soldiers liberated towns in Italy or the Netherlands, a different kind of war was unfolding in the skies above Europe and in the factories, laboratories, and training fields across Canada's vast landscape. It was here behind the front lines that Canada built the power that fed the Allied war machine, the Air War. Canada takes to the skies. The Royal Canadian Air Force entered the war small and inexperienced. But within a few years, it had become one of the most important air forces in the world. Tens of thousands of Canadian airmen flew with RAF Bomber Command, Fighter Command, and Coastal Command. Their missions were some of the most dangerous of the war. Bomber crews flying over Germany faced flak bursts that tore wings apart, night fighters that appeared like shadows, and freezing winds that killed within minutes. The average bomber crewman had a life expectancy measured in weeks. Yet, Canadians volunteered by the thousands. RCAF squadrons flew Lancasters, Halifaxes, Mosquitoes, Hurricanes, and Spitfires. They hunted submarines over the Atlantic, escorted convoys through storms, intercepted German bombers, and conducted night raids deep into industrial Germany. Many were barely 20 years old. Some came home as heroes. Many never returned at all. CAT, the aerodrome of democracy. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, CAP, was one of the greatest Canadian contributions of the entire war. Sprawled across the prairies and countryside from Quebec to British Columbia, hundreds of airfields, hangars, and classrooms sprang up almost overnight. Here under Canada's clear skies, aircrew from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and dozens of other nations trained with Canadian instructors. More than 130,000 airmen passed through CAP schools. It was one of the largest aviation training programs in history. Entire towns transformed. Prairie farmers found their quiet fields replaced by runways. Hotels filled with young pilots. Local dance halls hosted airmen in crisp uniforms. Crashes were common. Wooden crosses appeared at the edges of small town cemeteries. But the training continued, relentless, essential. CAT earned Canada a reputation as the aerodrome of democracy. Without it, the Allied air war could not have been sustained. Factories, Canada's industrial miracle. War production reshaped the entire country. In 1939, Canada's manufacturing base was modest. By 1945, it had exploded into one of the world's largest producers of war materials. Factories produced aircraft Hurricanes, Lancasters, Anson, armored vehicles, Valentine tanks, Ram tanks, carriers, artillery, and ammunition. Millions of shells, bombs, rifles, and machine guns. Ships, corvettes, frigates, landing craft. In 6 years, Canada built more than 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany produced during the entire war. Shipyards in Quebec and British Columbia worked around the clock. Manufacturing cities like Hamilton, Montreal, Windsor, and Oshawa turned into industrial fortresses. Ontario's automotive industry became a tank and truck assembly powerhouse. Vancouver built cargo ships and repair vessels for Pacific operations. Women at war. As men deployed overseas, millions of Canadian women stepped into roles they had never been allowed to occupy. They operated lathes, assembled aircraft wings, loaded shells, inspected engines, and drove trucks. They joined the Women's Royal Canadian Naval Service, WRCNS, the Canadian Women's Army Corps, SUAC, and the RCAF Women's Division. Their work was often dangerous. Some were killed in factory explosions or training accidents. Others suffered long-term health damage from chemicals and machinery. But they proved something undeniable. Canadian women were essential to victory. Science, innovation, and hidden contributions. Canada became a hub for wartime science. The National Research Council, NRC, developed advanced radar systems, anti-submarine sensors, improved explosives, and medical innovations. Canadian chemists played roles in early Atomic research under the secret tube alloys program. War reshaped classrooms, too. Universities expanded engineering, physics, and chemistry programs, laying foundations for Canada's post-war scientific expansion. The arsenal of democracy. By 1945, Canada, once a modest industrial nation, had become one of the world's great suppliers of war materials. Its contributions were not explosive moments on a battlefield, but sustained, disciplined, relentless production. It was here, in factories lit through the night, in classrooms humming with engines, in hangars filled with the smell of machine oil, that Canada quietly forged a decisive edge for the Allied cause. Canada didn't just fight the war, it built the tools that made victory possible. While Canadian troops were fighting across Italy, Normandy, and the Netherlands, another battle was unfolding at home. It was quieter, fought not with rifles, but with ration books, factory shifts, political debates, and social tensions. This was the Canadian home front, complex, determined, and sometimes deeply conflicted. Rationing and daily sacrifices. Shortages reshaped Canadian life. Butter, sugar, meat, gasoline, and rubber were rationed. Families kept victory gardens to offset food shortages. Children collected scrap metal and rubber tires. Housewives saved cooking fat for making explosives. War bonds campaigns spread across towns and cities where families bought bonds despite tight budgets, believing every dollar might help bring a loved one home sooner. The entire society shifted into wartime rhythm. Trains were crowded with troops. Freight lines operated non-stop. Radio broadcasts provided war updates and instructions. Posters encouraged thrift, vigilance, and sacrifice. For many, the war was not distant. It was woven into every grocery purchase, every letter from the front, every knock at the door. The conscription crisis of 1944. Conscription was the deepest fracture in the Canadian homefront. In 1917, forced conscription had nearly torn the country apart, especially between English Canada and Quebec. Mackenzie King remembered this well. Early in World War II, he promised conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. For most of the war, Canada relied on volunteers. But by late 1944, casualties in Italy and Northwest Europe were rising sharply. Infantry replacements were running out. The generals demanded reinforcements. King faced an impossible choice: break his promise to Quebec by deploying conscripts overseas or leave Canadian units under strength in critical battles. After painful debate and political collapse within his own cabinet, King allowed a limited number of conscripts to be sent overseas. The decision sparked protests in Quebec and anger in English Canada. It did not explode into full crisis like 1917, but it left lasting bitterness. The conscription issue revealed Canada's ongoing struggle. How to fight a united war when the country itself was not fully united. Internment and injustice. War also brought fear and injustice. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, more than 22,000 Japanese Canadians, most of them citizens, were forcibly removed from the West Coast. Their homes, fishing boats, and businesses were confiscated. Families were separated, placed in internment camps, or sent to work in rural farms and road crews. Italian and German Canadians faced surveillance and suspicion. Many lost jobs or were detained without trial. Communities that had lived peacefully in Canada for decades suddenly found themselves labeled as potential enemies. Indigenous soldiers volunteered in high numbers despite living under discriminatory laws. After the war, many returned home without veterans' benefits, land rights, or equal treatment. These contradictions would haunt Canada for decades. A nation fighting for freedom abroad while limiting freedom for some at home. Social change and new opportunities. Despite the injustices, World War II accelerated profound social change. Women's employment surged, breaking traditional gender roles. Union membership expanded. Scientific and industrial jobs opened to new groups. Urbanization accelerated as Canadians moved to cities for war work. The homeland became a crucible in its own right, testing the nation's character, just as the battlefield tested its soldiers. Sorrow and waiting. For many families, the homeland was a place of anxious waiting. Mothers checked mailboxes daily for letters. Wives worked long hours while raising children alone. Telegram boys became symbols of dread. Every knock on the door could bring devastating news. Entire neighborhoods gathered around radios during major offensives. The war was lived collectively in tearful vigils, in patriotic rallies, in the scraping sound of ration tins, and in the empty seats at dinner tables. The burden shared. The home front revealed Canada's strength and its weaknesses. It showed a society capable of enormous sacrifice and unity, but also one struggling with division, inequality, and fear. While soldiers fought on the ridges of Italy and in the hedge of Normandy, millions of Canadians fought in factories, farms, classrooms, mines, and kitchens. They kept the country running. They kept the war machines supplied. They bore the emotional weight of every casualty list. Without their effort, no Canadian soldier would have reached Ortona, Juno Beach, or the Scheldt. The home front was not a supporting act. It was the beating heart of Canada's war. As 1945 dawned, the war in Europe was entering its final act. For the 1st Canadian Army, battle hardened from Normandy, the Channel ports, and the Scheldt. There was one last chapter to write, and it would be written in the flat, flooded fields, starving cities, and desperate villages of the Netherlands. The Netherlands, a nation starving. The Dutch people had suffered through the brutal hunger winter of 1944-45. German blockades, destroyed rail lines, and freezing temperatures had cut food supplies to near zero. Families burned furniture to stay warm. Children fainted in the streets. Thousands died of starvation. When Canadian armored columns crossed into the Netherlands, they were met not by cheering crowds at first, but by hollow faces, thin bodies, and silent suffering. Then something remarkable happened. As Canadians advanced, locals emerged from hiding, waving flags they had sewn in secret, climbing onto tanks, showering soldiers with tulips, tears, and embraces. The children ran beside the vehicles, reaching for chocolate, biscuits, and tins of rations. Soldiers gave everything they could spare. The bond between the Netherlands and Canada, still strong today, was forged in those months of desperation and rescue. A gentle liberation. Unlike other liberation forces, the Canadians understood the devastation the Dutch had endured. Their orders emphasized restraint and humanity. They negotiated localized ceasefires to deliver food across enemy lines. In April 1945, Canadian and German commanders even coordinated Operation Manachauhan with the RAF and USAF to drop food from the sky. The Canadians also helped rebuild immediately, clearing mines, restoring power, repairing roads, and distributing medical supplies. In some areas, they shared their own rations until they had almost nothing left. To the Dutch, Canada became more than an army. It became a lifeline. German PS, the other side of liberation. As Germany collapsed, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers surrendered across Europe. Tens of thousands were sent to Canada as PS, a journey many would later describe as the most humane chapter of their captivity. Prisoners lived in camps across Ontario, Alberta, Quebec, and Manitoba. Compared to the horrors of Eastern Front captivity, Canadian camps were orderly, disciplined, and unexpectedly humane. PS. Built roads, harvested timber, worked on farms, played soccer, and even formed orchestras and theater groups. Some guards organized hockey games. Others learned German to talk to prisoners as human beings rather than enemies. Not everything was perfect. There were escapes, fights, and occasional harsh discipline. But the contrast with Axis treatment of PS was striking. When prisoners returned to Germany after the war, many wrote letters of gratitude. Some later immigrated to Canada. Kauf, Canada as an occupation power. After Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945, the Canadian Army Occupation Force (CAOF) took on a new role. They were no longer liberators or combatants. They were peacekeepers, administrators, and mediators in a shattered nation. Canadian troops patrolled ruined cities, supervised disarmament, distributed aid, helped rebuild infrastructure, protected civilians from revenge attacks. Some soldiers struggled with the moral complexity of occupying a defeated enemy. They encountered German families who had lost homes, food, or children. Many Canadian soldiers, having known hunger and hardship during their own upbringing, quietly shared supplies. This mixture of firmness and humanity would become a hallmark of Canada's international role in the decades to come, the return home. For soldiers who had survived Sicily, Ortona, the Scheldt, and the Netherlands, coming home was both joyous and difficult. Canada greeted them with parades, hugs, and tears. But reintegration was often painful. Veterans faced PTSD, then called battle exhaustion, nightmares. From Ortona or Normandy, unemployment, disabilities. The emotional weight of fallen comrades, families had changed, children grew up without fathers. Entire neighborhoods bore scars of the telegram boys who had visited too often. Yet the return also marked a rebirth, a chance to rebuild a country that had found a new sense of identity through war. Canada had gone overseas as a dominion. It returned as a nation. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world was not the same, and neither was Canada. A nation that entered the war unsure of its role emerged with a new sense of confidence, purpose, and identity. It had fought across the Atlantic, in the skies above Germany, in the mountains of Italy, on the beaches of Normandy, and in the flooded fields of the Netherlands. It had built one of the great wartime industrial machines. It had supplied the world's air forces, guarded the oceans, trained aviators from around the globe, and liberated millions trapped under tyranny. Canada had changed deeply and permanently. A middle power with a voice. Before the war, Canada was often seen as an extension of Britain. After the war, it stood on its own. Its sacrifices gave it a powerful diplomatic voice. Canada played key roles in founding the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and later NATO. This era marked the birth of the idea of Canada as a middle power, a country not defined by size or weaponry, but by moral authority, diplomacy, and a willingness to shoulder responsibility. A stronger, more modern economy. War work transformed the economy. New industries emerged. Manufacturing became a national engine. Research institutions expanded. Infrastructure projects accelerated. Women's wartime labor opened the door to long-term workforce changes. Veterans programs provided education, housing, and employment assistance, fueling a post-war boom that would reshape the middle class, a more inclusive yet imperfect society. World War II began conversations that would shape Canada's social future. Japanese-Canadian internment would later lead to national apology and compensation. Indigenous veterans' mistreatment sparked demands for civil rights. Women's contributions established the groundwork for future equality movements. Immigration regulations began to shift, influenced by wartime alliances and the demand for labor. Canada's diversity, long suppressed under old biases, began to emerge as one of its greatest assets. The weight of memory. The war left behind cemeteries throughout Europe. Rows of maple leaves engraved into white headstones. These tranquil resting places in France, Italy, the Netherlands, and Germany serve as reminders of the price paid by a small nation of 11 million. Families preserved letters tied with ribbon. Veterans carried recollections they seldom spoke aloud of friends lost in the surf at Juno, the ruins of Ortona, the mud of the Scheldt, and Dutch children running alongside their tanks. A nation reborn. World War II compelled Canada to confront who it was and who it aspired to be. The answer unfolded gradually, shaped by sacrifice, bravery, errors, innovation, and compassion. Canada entered the war as a cautious country. It emerged as a respected nation. It entered as a dominion. It emerged as a middle power. It entered uncertain of its identity. It emerged with one forged in battlefields, factories, classrooms, shipyards, and liberated cities. The legacy of World War II is not merely military. It is political, economic, social, and profoundly human. It is the story of millions of Canadians who stepped forward when the world trembled, who endured hardship at home and horror abroad, and who helped construct a post-war world that aspired, however imperfectly, toward peace. The documentary concludes not with triumphalism, but with remembrance. Canada's World War II story is not one of conquest. It is one of duty, one of sacrifice, one of liberation, and one of transformation.